Tonight, as the world outside begins to quiet its busy hum, and you find yourself settling into a space of comfort and calm, let us embark together on a gentle journey. We will explore a landscape of ideas, a realm of thought that has, in its own unique way, touched the minds and hearts of countless individuals across our shared human history. It is a philosophy, a way of seeing the world, that some might even say has swept through societies with an impact akin to the great narratives that have shaped our civilizations. Yet, in our quiet exploration tonight, we will approach these concepts not as calls to action, but as a series of reflections, a tranquil story whispered softly to help you unwind, and perhaps, as we delve deeper, to drift into a peaceful and restorative sleep. We are going to consider the ideas of Karl Marx, a thinker whose influence has been truly global, inspiring movements and conversations around the world. Since the publication of his seminal work, Capital Volume 1, back in 1867, his insights have quietly, yet powerfully, guided revolutionary movements and provided a framework for understanding history and society in a scientific, systematic manner. Tonight we will only scratch the surface, providing a broad, gentle sketch of his theories, focusing on some of his key arguments and concepts. There is no need for haste, no urgency in understanding, simply an invitation to listen, to contemplate, and to relax. Karl Marx was a man who, you might say, wore many hats, each one offering a distinct lens through which to observe the complex tapestry of human existence. He was a meticulous journalist, delving into the daily events that shaped his world, a thoughtful historian, tracing the long arcs of human development, a sharp political economist, dissecting the very mechanisms of wealth and labor, a diligent scientist, seeking patterns and laws within the social fabric, a perceptive sociologist, keenly observing how individuals interact within their communities, and a tireless labor activist, advocating for the working people of his time. But above all these roles, he was in his essence a socialist revolutionary, driven by a profound desire to reshape the world into a more just and equitable place. The sheer breadth and depth of his thought, the intricate complexity of his ideas, are truly shaped by the multitude of perspectives he adopted, each allowing him to position himself at a different vantage point within the grand social totality he was analyzing. What he might perceive and comprehend from one angle, or through one specific lens, could sometimes appear subtly different, or even at times seem to gently contradict what he observed from another point within that very same encompassing social structure. The remarkable depth and expansive scope of Marx's analytical framework, therefore, were born from his persistent ongoing effort, a quiet intellectual struggle, to forge a coherent scientific interpretation of the various, often perplexing, contradictions that continually presented themselves in his rigorous analyses, is a method of inquiry that has since come to be known, and indeed is now widely referred to, as dialectical or historical materialism. It is a way of understanding, a gentle method of peeling back the layers of our shared reality. To truly grasp the essence of dialectical materialism, let us first, and very gently, consider the threads from which it was woven. One of these vital threads, the concept of the dialectic itself, was thoughtfully borrowed from the profound philosophical insights of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel, in his grand vision, essentially proposed that the majestic sweep of world history unfolded not as a simple linear progression, but rather through a continuous and dynamic struggle, a kind of elegant dance between opposing ideas. For Hegel, society was in a perpetual gentle process of working through, of resolving, the inherent contradictions that arose between the prevailing ideas of any given era. These ideas, he observed, would negate each other, they would softly clash, they would appear to contradict one another, they would struggle in a subtle intellectual combat, and through this constant interplay, they would develop and gradually transform. This ongoing quiet struggle between ideas, Hegel posited, inevitably created new contradictions, which society would then strive, in its own measured pace, to resolve. But in the very act of resolution, new contradictions would emerge, like fresh shoots after a gentle rain, ensuring that the history of human society would continue its endless process of change, development, and evolution. Hegel referred to this profound onward movement as Geist, a term often translated as the spirit of history, or simply mind or spirit. This Geist, he believed, ultimately unfolded with a deep sense of purpose, a gentle trajectory towards progress. He passionately argued that the truly progressive element within this Geist, this spirit of history, or the historical dialectic, lay precisely in its movement towards an ever greater realization of freedom. This journey, he envisioned, would eventually reach its ultimate and final stage in a grand reconciliation, a harmonious merging between the subject and the object, where in a profound sense, all distinctions, all perceived separations between human beings and the external natural world would gently dissolve. It is a vision of unity, a quiet whisper of ultimate harmony. Now let us turn our attention to the second vital thread, the concept of materialism, a notion thoughtfully derived from Ludwig Feuerbach's insightful criticism of Christianity and the idea of God. Marx, in his early writings, openly praised Feuerbach's robust materialism for its powerful demonstration of how what he called religious idealism, often appearing to float above earthly concerns, actually had its deep foundations and ancient roots firmly embedded in an objective, material reality. Feuerbach argued, with a quiet conviction, that the Christian notion of God was, in its essence, a sublime embodiment of all the divine and most admirable qualities of humanity itself. Yet these qualities were, in a curious act of projection, lifted from the earth and cast into the heavens. He contended quite simply that God did not create man, but rather, with a profound irony, man, in his own image, created God. God, in Feuerbach's view, was humanity's perfect self-image, an idealized reflection of itself, an image of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-caring, beautiful, truthful, and utterly sublime being. Thus, for man to truly find God, he must first and most importantly recognize himself within God, seeing in that divine figure the ideal perfect image of his own human potential. Religion, Feuerbach gently suggested, in this specific interpretation, had the effect of separating all the finest, most cherished qualities of humanity and placing them outside of human beings, as something external to them, something beyond their immediate grasp. And in this subtle yet profound way, Feuerbach argued, God ultimately became, for humanity, a poignant form of self-alienation. It is a gentle shifting of perspective, moving from the ethereal back to the tangible, back to ourselves. Marx, with his keen intellect, was deeply inspired by both of these profound thinkers, by the grand sweep of Hegel's historical vision, and the grounded reality of Feuerbach's materialism. Yet, with a quiet brilliance, he turned their own insights gently against each other, weaving them into a new, more comprehensive tapestry of understanding. He argued, with careful deliberation, that while Hegel had indeed, and quite correctly, identified the dynamic, unfolding dialectical process of history, he had, in Marx's view, misplaced the true locus of the development of these contradictions. Hegel had situated them primarily in the production and struggle of ideas, in the ethereal reflection of reality, rather than in reality itself, in the tangible material conditions of human existence. On the other hand, while Feuerbach, with his clear-sightedness, had undeniably and correctly identified the material basis of ideas, and truly understood that ideas were often merely subtle reflections of objective reality, His materialism, Marx contended, lacked a crucial dimension. It did not fully embrace a historical, social, or dialectical character. In essence, Marx saw that Hegel's majestic historical sweep needed Feuerbach's firm grounding in materialism, and conversely, Feuerbach's grounded materialism deeply needed Hegel's dynamic, historical dialectic. It was a perfect intellectual synergy waiting to be discovered. In short, the gentle yet profound marriage between Hegel's concept of history as an unfolding dynamic process and Feuerbach's concept of materialism, which roots all ideas in the tangible world, would serve as the singular, powerful inspiration for Marx's own methodological approach, a method that would come to be known as historical or dialectical materialism. This intellectual fusion also profoundly shaped his general approach to what he famously termed his ruthless criticism of everything existing. Tonight, however, we will view this ruthless criticism not as an aggressive assault, but as a calm, systematic, and deeply reflective analysis, a careful peeling back of layers, particularly as he applied it to the realm of political economy, the very engine of modern society. It is a quiet inquiry, a steady gaze upon the world as it is. In his meticulous analysis, Marx consistently placed a profound primacy on the intricate process of production. He understood with crystal clarity that it was this fundamental process by which society brings forth, creates, and continually renews the very material conditions of its own existence. He recognized with deep insight that human societies must, by their very nature, form a dynamic metabolic relationship with the natural world around them. Furthermore, he observed that they must develop cooperative forms of social production simply to exist, to endure, as human beings. For it is through this essential interaction that we satisfy our most basic material needs, the need for sustenance, for clean water, for clothing to protect us, for shelter to keep us safe, and for all the countless other fundamental requirements that allow us to thrive. As human beings quietly go about shaping their material life, as they engage in the act of production, this very process, the productive and material life of a society, then fundamentally determines how that society will in turn develop its myriad unproductive activities. These activities span the vast spheres of culture, religion, politics, leisure, and every other non-economic activity or institution that enriches human experience. The very manner in which a society gently satisfies its material needs shapes and ultimately determines the conditions under which different cultural, ideological, religious, artistic or political possibilities may or may not emerge and flourish. This is why Marx, in a somewhat simplified but deeply illustrative manner, referred to the economy as the fundamental base of society, while lovingly describing other crucial social processes, such as politics, religion, and culture, as the ideological superstructure of society. This superstructure, he gently suggested, initially emerges organically from the base of society, like a plant growing from fertile soil. However, once established, it gradually becomes relatively autonomous, gaining its own momentum, and in turn, quietly enacts its own subtle yet powerful influence back onto the base, creating a dynamic reciprocal relationship. It is a beautiful image, the foundation of our world gently shaping everything that rises above it. For the vast majority of what we understand as anthropological history, the economic base of human society was largely characterized and dominated by a mode of production that Marx's close collaborator, Friedrich Engels, thoughtfully referred to as primitive communism. He chose the term communism with great care, specifically to highlight the profound, yet often overlooked, fact that these prehistoric social formations were, in essence, classless societies. They were societies without a state apparatus, without money as a medium of exchange, and crucially, without the concept of private property as we understand it today. In these ancient quiet communities, everyone shared a free, open and fundamentally democratic access to the bountiful fruits of nature. The processes of production and the subsequent distribution of goods were, in these times, remarkably egalitarian. Members of these communities formed deep organic bonds, woven together by highly ritualistic practices, a spirit of profound cooperation, and a deep-seated mutualism. It was a time perhaps of quiet harmony, a shared existence where the concept of individual accumulation was largely absent. Marx's profound understanding of history, as we gently continue our journey, posits that the history of class struggle, in its more recognizable form, began to emerge with the appearance of slavery, approximately around 6000 BCE. This mode of production then gradually evolved, transitioning through the feudal epoch, and eventually, in a relatively more recent historical shift, moved into the era of capitalism, roughly spanning the 15th to the 18th century. Each distinct stage, each epoch in the long and winding history of human society, Marx observed, is fundamentally defined by the particular manner in which the forces of production, a term encompassing the technologies, tools, and technical knowledge available, and human labor itself are organized. This organization occurs through what he termed the relations of production, which describe how people relate to each other in the production process, especially concerning ownership and control. As the technologies available to a society and its collective technical knowledge slowly develop and advance, these evolving forces of production inevitably change. This change, in turn, gradually creates subtle, and eventually more overt, contradictions within the prevailing relations of production. When these contradictions become sufficiently acute, the system undergoes a profound process of transformation, often culminating in what Marx referred to as a revolution, a fundamental reordering of society. Throughout this sweeping history, these relations of production consistently give rise to distinct class differences primarily based on how labor is organized and how property is distributed across society. It is a slow, methodical unfolding of social dynamics. Slavery, as a distinct mode of production, quietly begins its emergence in the ancient Mesopotamian and Sumerian societies, around that distant period of 6000 BCE. From these early cradles of civilization, it gradually spreads, its influence rippling outwards, eventually appearing across almost the entire world, though in varying forms. Slavery, Marx observed, marks a profound historical turning point, as it represents the very first mode of production, where the concepts of private property, in its more defined sense, and a stratified class system, truly begin to emerge and take root. Under this arrangement, the laborer, the person performing the essential work, becomes, in a stark and tangible sense, the actual property of the master. The master, through purchase or conquest, acquires the slave, owns the slave, and possesses the legal right to sell, trade, or even, tragically, dispose of the slave, as if they were any other possession or commodity. The slave class, by definition, owns no property whatsoever. They provide all the social labor that underpins the society, yet they receive only a meager portion of the total value that their immense efforts create. Conversely, the master class, the owners, holds dominion over all the property, performs none of the actual labor, but systematically appropriates, for its own benefit, the entirety of the value produced by the diligent labor of the slave class. Under this arrangement, the slave class, in its very essence, finds itself in a constant, though often suppressed, struggle against these prevailing relations of production that so profoundly exploit their labor. This struggle, Marx argued, eventually gives rise to deep-seated irreconcilable antagonisms and fundamental contradictions, tensions that cannot be simply smoothed over. These contradictions, in their own time, necessitate a resolution, a profound societal shift that can only be brought about through a fundamental transformation, a revolution, which then ushers in a new mode of production. It is a quiet, yet powerful, unfolding of societal transformation. After thousands of years, the slavery mode of production, in its various manifestations, generally reaches a point of collapse or gradual transformation, slowly giving way to the feudal mode of production, typically around the 5th century in Europe, though its emergence varied across the globe. Unlike the social formations prevalent in the ancient city-states, the feudal era finds its primary expression and comes to fruition largely in the tranquil countryside, fostering a stark and profound division between the bustling town and the serene agrarian country. Under feudalism, the upper class, the ruling stratum, is no longer primarily defined by property ownership in the form of human beings, as was the case with slaves. Instead, their power and status are rooted in the ownership of land, vast tracts of territory that form the backbone of their wealth. The worker, under this new arrangement, is no longer a slave, entirely owned by a master, but rather becomes a peasant, or more commonly, a serf. Having no land of their own, these individuals are bound to work on the land owned by someone else, a powerful landlord or noble. The peasant class, much like the slave class before it, owns no property of significance. They perform all the laborious tasks, cultivating the land and producing the necessary goods, but they receive only a portion of the total value that their tireless labor creates. The landlord class, on the other hand, owns all the land and its resources, performs none of the direct labor, but quietly appropriates the value produced by the diligent hands of the peasant class. However, as the quiet tides of history continue to turn, the relentless conquests of empires, the subtle emergence of a new dynamic bourgeois class, composed of merchants and artisans, and the gradual rise of small-scale industry begin, over time, to give clear expression to the growing contradictions between the developing forces of production, new technologies, and ways of working, and the established relations of production under the feudal era. By the close of the 15th century, the venerable structure of feudalism, which had stood for so long, begins its slow, inexorable crumbling, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, gives rise to the nascent stages of capitalism. It is a gentle, yet powerful, shift in the very foundations of society. The very embryo of the capitalist mode of production, its earliest beginnings, can be quietly observed with the rise of merchant capital in the vibrant cities of Italy during the glorious Renaissance, roughly in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, it is not until the close of the 18th century, with the sweeping changes of the Industrial Revolution, that capitalism is truly recognized as a fundamentally distinct and dominant mode of production, reshaping societies across the globe. Under capitalism, the ruling bourgeois class, the owners of capital, is no longer defined by productive relations based on the outright ownership of human beings, as in slavery, or by the extensive ownership of land, as in feudalism. Instead, their power and position are rooted in the ownership, and crucially, the control over the very means of production, the factories, the machinery, the raw materials, and the infrastructure necessary to produce goods and services. Under this mode of production, the working class, often referred to as the proletariat, does not own these means of production. They perform all of the work, the actual labor, but are compensated with only a portion of the total value that their labor produces. On the other hand, the bourgeois class, the capitalists, owns all the property related to production, performs none of the direct work, but systematically appropriates the surplus value generated by the labor of the proletariat. Capitalism, Marx observed, is a truly distinct and complex mode of production characterized by a confluence of unique historical developments that emerge and correspond with each other in intricate ways. These include the widespread phenomenon of mass commodity production, where goods are produced primarily for sale in a market rather than for direct use. The firm establishment of private ownership over the means of production, concentrating control in the hands of a few. The prevalence of exchange relations where everything, even labor, can be bought and sold. A highly intricate social division of labor, specializing tasks. The institution of wage labor, where individuals sell their ability to work for a fixed price. And the generalization and crystallization of a global universal money, among many other subtle and profound developments. It is important to gently note that certain aspects of the capitalist system, such as money itself or the concept of private property, actually predate capitalism by millennia, existing in earlier forms. However, other characteristic aspects, like the systematic mass production of commodities for market exchange, are truly unique to the capitalist system itself. At its core, it is vital to understand that money itself, or labor power in isolation, or the means of production, or even commodities in their general form, are not in and of themselves capital. They only truly become capital, as in our gentle example here, when they are strategically employed to produce commodities that are then sold for more than what they originally cost. The increase in money that the capitalist ultimately finishes with, compared to the amount he initially began with, is what Marx, in his profound analysis, referred to as surplus value. These two concepts, capital and surplus value, are in their essence key components, vital threads introduced in Marx's insightful analysis of the capitalist system. They are ideas designed to help demystify the often mysterious way in which capital presents itself, almost as if it were a magical goose that effortlessly lays golden eggs, a form of value that seemingly of its own accord mysteriously produces even more value. It is a quiet uncovering of an underlying truth. In Marx's monumental work, his magnum opus Capital Volume 1, he begins his intricate analysis by gently noting a profound characteristic of commodities under capitalism. They possess a form of value that rather uniquely contains a dual nature. All commodities, without exception, possess what he termed a use value. This means, quite simply, that every commodity, be it a loaf of bread, a warm coat, or a tool, has a concrete usefulness. It possesses the inherent ability to satisfy a specific human need when it is consumed or utilized. But in addition to this tangible use value, all commodities also embody an exchange value. This means, theoretically, that every commodity can be exchanged for any other commodity in the market, with money often serving as the universal equivalent for facilitating these exchanges. Capitalists, however, Marx observed, largely hold no regard, no particular attachment, for the use value of the commodities they deal in. Their sole and primary concern is simply with the exchange value of the commodity, its potential to be sold for profit. Imagine, for instance, a capitalist who owns a chain of bustling bakeries. This individual might, quite incidentally, be intolerant to gluten, or simply never choose to consume the bread produced in their own establishments. It wouldn't matter in the slightest to their business model, because they do not produce the bread for their own consumption, but rather with the singular purpose of selling it, of realizing its exchange value. This fundamental condition, where goods are produced not primarily for their inherent usefulness, but rather for their exchange value, for their potential to be bought and sold, forms the very basis of what Marx so eloquently called commodity fetishism. It is a quiet illusion, where the social relations embedded in production are masked by the apparent intrinsic value of the commodity itself. Marx, with his piercing insight, then gently highlights how even labor power, the human capacity to work, is itself commodified under capitalism, and in a parallel manner comes to take on this dual characteristic. Much like any other commodity, labor, the very act of human exertion, is undeniably useful. It combines itself with nature, with raw materials and tools, to produce tangible use values or commodities that satisfy human needs. But crucially, under capitalism, labor also possesses an exchange value. It can be sold in the marketplace, in exchange for a wage, becoming a commodity itself. The bourgeoisie, the class that owns capital, purchases or rents this labor power from the proletariat, the working class, in the form of wage labor. The proletariat, the working class, by its very definition, does not own capital. They possess no means of production. Therefore they have nothing else to sell in the marketplace, except for their own labor power, their ability to work. The wage labor system is therefore quietly premised on the proletarian class separating, or alienating, its labor power from its own autonomous control. This precious human capacity, this ability to create and produce, is then commodified and sold to a capitalist, who takes over control of all the conditions surrounding their labor. This profound process of selling, or alienating, one's labor to a capitalist, is what Marx referred to with deep contemplation as alienated labor. It is a gentle drifting apart, a quiet separation from one's own creative essence. Marx argued, with a profound sense of understanding, that this condition of alienated labor quietly detaches, or alienates, the worker from four fundamental aspects of what it means to be fully human, of what constitutes our very species being. Firstly, it alienates the worker from the product of their own creation, the very essence of human labor. Its realization, its culmination, is found in its objectification, in its transformation into a tangible material form. The human species, uniquely among all living beings, is the only one where individuals do not solely produce for their immediate individual needs. Instead, we possess the remarkable capacity to create complex technologies, to conceive of groundbreaking inventions, and to weave intricate tapestries of culture, all of which profoundly implicate, gently shape, and fundamentally change the entirety of humanity. Yet, through the insidious process of alienation, capital, the system itself, quietly expropriates the product of this labor from the laborer. The very objects, the commodities, that embody the worker's skill, effort, and creative energy, become something separate from, something alien to, the worker who brought them into being. The more the laborer produces, the more they pour their life into the material world, the more they become, ironically, alienated from this very world they themselves create. We can observe the poignant reality of workers potentially going hungry even in the wealthiest of societies, societies that in their abundance might quietly dispose of surplus food into the trash. It is a quiet paradox, a profound disconnect. Secondly, alienated labor gently separates the workers from the labor process itself. For the worker, the act of labor, the very process of creation, is no longer primarily a means of broad social production, no longer an act of producing for the benefit of the whole of society, for the satisfaction of universal human needs, or for the enrichment of human culture as a whole. Instead, the worker is no longer a free, creative, and socially engaged creature, finding fulfillment in their work. Rather, they become subtly coerced into labor, compelled to work primarily to secure their individual means of subsistence, to earn a wage simply to survive. Labor, in this alienated state, becomes something external to the worker. It is no longer an expression of their inner self. It now belongs to a capitalist, an owner, who assumes complete control over all the conditions of their labor. The capitalist dictates, with quiet authority, what to make, how to make it. where to make it, and even the precise timing, when the worker can start, when they must stop, when they must return to work, when they can eat, when they can speak. They also determine how much, how often, and for how long they will be paid, when they might be laid off, or even when they might be fired. The immense ingenuity and profound creativity that could define the labor process, which truly holds the potential to be humanity's greatest realization of itself, an expression of our deepest capabilities, comes instead under the subtle sway and controlling influence of capital. It is a quiet disempowerment, a subtle loss of agency. Thirdly, this alienation extends further, gently separating the worker from themselves, and from what Marx termed their species being. Marx understood with great clarity that human beings, like all other living creatures, emerged directly from the natural world. We are, in our very essence, an integral part of nature. Yet what fundamentally distinguishes humans from all other animals is our unique capacity to consciously and willfully manipulate nature, to reshape our environment according to our intentions. Humans are the only creatures known to possess the intricate ability to create abstract models of production in their minds, to consciously organize complex social labor, and then to materialize these abstract models through the physical process of labor, bringing their thoughts into tangible reality. These conscious, creative, social, and productive aspects are, in Marx's view, precisely what define humans as a distinct species, what constitutes our species being. When humans engage these capacities, when we consciously, creatively, and socially produce from nature, we not only change nature itself, but in doing so, we also fundamentally change our own nature as natural creatures. This dynamic metabolic interaction, this continuous give and take between humans and nature, is for Marx the natural healthy state of being for the human species. But under capitalism, capital, in its relentless pursuit of accumulation, quietly robs the worker of their creative capacities, it subtly diminishes the social aspect of their labor, and it gently disrupts their fundamental social bonds with one another. In doing so, it disrupts the basic needs and natural expression of the species, sinking the worker to the level of a mere commodity, a replaceable cog, thereby alienating the worker from their own profound species being. It is a quiet diminishment, a subtle erosion of what makes us truly human. And fourthly, this pervasive alienation, in its quiet unfolding, alienates workers from each other, and in a broader sense from humanity itself. As conscious, creative, and inherently social creatures, human beings naturally relate to one another through productive relations. We collaborate, we share tasks, we build things together. But under the capitalist mode of production, where productive relations are fundamentally structured as class relations, creating a division between the bourgeois property owners and the propertyless proletarians, the very relations between human beings become subtly antagonistic and often hostile. This antagonism, this quiet tension, pervades the entire realm of circulation, the marketplace, as every buyer, driven by economic necessity, quietly seeks the lowest possible price, while every seller, equally driven, seeks to secure the highest possible price for whatever commodity is being exchanged. Furthermore, social antagonisms are also created within classes, taking the form of relentless competition. The bourgeois class quietly competes amongst themselves for a greater share of surplus value, constantly vying for market dominance. Simultaneously, the proletarian class, often unknowingly, competes for the limited number of available wages, for the opportunity to sell their labor. In essence, the totality of social relations, the intricate web of human interaction, is subtly facilitated and produced through the interests of capital itself, often setting individuals and groups gently against each other. It is truly important to note as we quietly consider these profound ideas, that alienation, in Marx's understanding, is not merely an individual affliction, like a personal feeling of depression or anxiety, nor is it simply an inclination or a fleeting sentiment that one might have towards the circumstances surrounding their labor. Rather, alienated labor is depicted as a deeply structural condition and a pervasive process, an inherent feature that fundamentally shapes and lends a unique, defining characteristic to the very nature of labor under the capitalist mode of production. Just as slave labor defines the form that work takes under the institution of slavery, alienated labor is, in Marx's view, the definitive form that labor assumes under the capitalist system. It is a systemic reality, a quiet, underlying truth about the way we organize our working lives. To understand more intimately the intricate capitalist production process, let us take a gentle, unassuming look at a relatively benign example, that of a small capitalist engaged in the time-honored business of baking bread. The labor process, in its essence, can be understood through a simple yet profound equation: embodied labor plus living labor equals total labor. Embodied labor represents all those commodities, all those materials and tools that the capitalist brings to the production process that are already infused with past human labor. In our example, if the capitalist is in the business of producing and selling delicious bread, he will quietly purchase flour, perhaps a few pots, yeast, an oven, a dough mixer, and so on. These materials, tools, and machines are, as Marx observed, also known as embodied labor because they were themselves produced by previous human effort and therefore embody, literally, the labor of others. Someone, somewhere, at some point, made these things. The flour was grown and milled, the oven was manufactured, the mixer assembled before they ever arrived in our capitalist baker's kitchen. In addition to this embodied labor, the capitalist will also quietly purchase human labor power, what Marx called living labor, from the marketplace of circulation. Like any other commodity, this labor is commodified, it is exchanged, it is alienated from the worker's direct control, and it is offered into circulation for a capitalist to purchase. The capitalist, or more likely their manager, will gently inspect resumes, conduct interviews, and then offer a specific wage, a price, for the recruitment of this labor power. The employee, the living labor, is then mixed, or combined, with the embodied labor through the delicate production process. The worker gently mixes the ingredients, kneads the dough with skill, bakes the bread, packages it up, and in the end, this living labor, this human effort, mixes seamlessly with the embodied labor of the materials and machines to produce the total labor embodied in the final fragrant loaf of bread. This, in its essence, is the tangible, material process of production, a quiet act of creation. But now let us take a closer, more subtle look at what Marx called the immaterial process of production, the valorization process, the way value is created and accumulated. Let us imagine, for the sake of our gentle example, that the value of the embodied labor in the bread production process, the cost of the raw materials and the wear and tear on the machines, is, let's say, $1. In other words, it cost the capitalist baker $1 worth of flour, yeast, the proportional usage of the machine, and so on. After the worker has diligently finished mixing their living labor with this $1 worth of material, and the bread is baked, they then sell the final product, the fragrant loaf, for, let's say, $3. Now, if the bread was sold for $3, and it was produced with $1 worth of embodied labor, the materials and machine use, how much value, we might gently ask, is the living labor, the worker's effort, adding to the total labor embodied in the bread? The answer, in this quiet calculation, is $2. The worker has skillfully mixed $1 worth of materials with $2 worth of their own labor to produce a $3 loaf of bread. Now at this delicate point, the capitalist baker is faced with a quiet, yet significant problem. If the laborer is adding $2 worth of value to the creation of the bread, then should the laborer be compensated? While it might seem clear to some, in a purely intuitive sense, that if the laborer is adding $2 worth of value, perhaps they should be compensated with the full $2 worth of value for their dedicated work. However, if the laborer were compensated the entire $2 of value they produce, that would leave nothing left over for the capitalist, except for the $1 he started with to cover his initial material costs. Here it is crucial to gently recall that the capitalist baker is not, in the fundamental logic of capitalism, primarily in business, simply to feed people, noble as that may be. He is rather in business to generate surplus value, without which, from his perspective, there would be no underlying point in selling bread at all, no reason to continue the enterprise. But since he cannot extract this additional value, this surplus from the portion added by the inanimate embodied labor, the materials and machines only transfer their own value, he must, by the very logic of the system, find a way to extract it from living labor, from the worker's effort. At the very end of the production process, the capitalist is left with the total labor embodied in the product. He takes a portion of this value to replenish his embodied labor, to buy more flour and cover machine depreciation. He then gives his worker only a portion of the value created by their living labor. The remainder, the crucial difference, he quietly keeps for himself in the form of surplus value. In other words, the capitalist effectively divides the value created by living labor into two distinct parts. First, the wages the laborer receives, and second, the remainder, which he appropriates for himself as surplus value. So, if the laborer, who added $2 of value to the bread, is only compensated $1 in wages, then the capitalist, in our quiet example, receives $1 in surplus value. In fact, the less the capitalist baker is compelled to pay his workers, the more he can quietly keep for himself in the form of surplus value. If he can manage to lower wages, perhaps to 50 cents rather than $1, he will gain an even greater surplus, $1.50 in this instance. Therefore, the capitalist baker, driven by the inherent logic of the system, maximizes his surplus value by paying his workers the bare minimum that the prevailing circumstances, the market forces, and societal conditions will gently permit. This profound process, this systematic expropriation by the capitalist of the value produced by labor, is what Marx referred to, with careful precision, as exploitation. It is not necessarily a conscious act of malice, but a structural imperative inherent in the system. Marx perceived, with a clear and insightful gaze, that each individual capitalist was subjected to an extraordinary pressure, a relentless, quiet imperative to generate as much surplus value as humanly possible, often by subtly exploiting their workers to the utmost extent allowed by the system. He understood that this exploitation was therefore not simply created through individual capitalist greed, though greed might certainly play a part, but was rather compelled by a deeper systemic impulse, the need to relentlessly contend with other capitalists under what he termed the coercive laws of competition. Under the silent yet powerful influence of these coercive laws of competition, if a hypothetical capitalist baker were to suddenly decide to eliminate, or even significantly lessen, the exploitation of labor within his bakery, eventually his competitors, those who continued to exploit their labor with full force, would quietly win out in the ongoing competition. These more ruthless competitors would be able to hire more employees, purchase greater quantities of raw materials, open new, more efficient shops, subtly lower their prices, perhaps even raise the perceived quality of their products. and inch by inch slowly but surely take over the entire bread market. Therefore, the surplus value that is generated is not simply hoarded, it is systematically reinvested back into the production process, in the form of more capital. This reinvestment serves as a means to generate even greater amounts of surplus value, which in turn becomes a larger magnitude of capital, which is then reinvested back into the production process to generate yet more surplus value, and so on, in an ever-expanding, quiet cycle. This continuous expanding cycle, where surplus value is perpetually reinvested as capital, to generate ever-increasing magnitudes of surplus value, is what Marx referred to as capital accumulation. The overall tendency for every capitalist enterprise to grow, to expand beyond its competitors, thus generates a relentless cycle of expanded reproduction. In essence, every capitalist enterprise must not only reproduce the existing production process, but must also necessarily expand that production process, or else risk being quietly overtaken and subsumed by larger, more aggressive competitors. It is a ceaseless, gentle drive towards growth. There are, Marx observed, two primary ways that the capitalist can subtly manipulate labor to effectively increase the generation of surplus value. They can manipulate labor time, thereby generating what Marx called absolute surplus value, or they can manipulate labor power itself by increasing the productivity of a given period of work and thereby increasing the amount of relative surplus value. Let us, with a quiet and illustrative example, take a closer look at the subtle difference between these two forms of surplus value in the production process. As we have already gently seen, the total value that is produced by the laborer is divided into two parts: the wages they receive and the surplus value that is appropriated. Therefore, labor time itself, the hours a worker spends, is also conceptually divided into two parts: the time that the laborer spends producing value in the form of their own wages, which Marx called necessary labor, and the time the laborer spends in the production of surplus value for the capitalist, which he called surplus labor. The capitalist can increase the production of surplus value by simply adding more time to the workday, the work week, the work year, or even, in a broader sense, to the worker's entire work life. Adding labor time in this manner means that the current rate of exploitation, the ratio between necessary and surplus labor, is maintained, but it is simply prolonged, extended over a longer period. Imagine a worker who produces $100 worth of bread in a 10-hour workday and is paid $50 for their labor. This implies in Marx's framework that the worker was producing the value of their own wages in 5 of those hours, the necessary labor time, and quietly producing surplus value for the capitalist for the other 5 hours, the surplus labor time. Now, if the capitalist decides to gently increase the workday to 12 hours, the worker is now producing $120 worth of value. And if their wage commensurately increases to $60, maintaining the same ratio of necessary labor time, then Marx referred to this increase in labor time and the resulting increase in surplus value in terms of absolute surplus value. This highlights how the ratio between necessary labor and surplus labor remains constant, or absolute, even with the increase or decrease in the total labor time. It is a straightforward extension of effort. On the other hand, the capitalist also quietly seeks to optimize relative surplus value by producing more goods, a greater quantity of output, within the very same amount of labor time, without increasing the pay. For example, if our capitalist baker introduces more efficient machinery into the production process, perhaps a more powerful, faster dough mixer, he may then demand that his workers produce a greater output of bread in the same fixed amount of time, for the same rate of pay. Now, let's imagine under these new conditions that labor is producing $160 worth of bread in that same 12-hour workday, but the wage does not increase and remains at $60. In this scenario, the worker is now producing the value of their own wages in a shorter period, perhaps 4.5 hours, and producing surplus value for the capitalist for the remaining 7.5 hours. When the workday produces more goods, a higher yield, without any increase in pay for the worker, the ratio, or the division, between necessary labor and surplus labor becomes increasingly disproportionate, with surplus labor growing relative to necessary labor. When it comes to machines themselves, Marx observed, they are, in essence, no different from any other commodity in one crucial respect. Their price in the market is often lower than their actual value. To make this subtle yet profound distinction between price and value clear, let us first gently consider the price or cost of the machine, independently of its deeper value. Bourgeois political economy, the prevailing economic thought, often adopts the view of the capitalist, and from this particular vantage point, it is not deemed necessary, or even useful, to make a clear distinction between price and value. Bourgeois political economy, in following the perspective of the capitalist, tends to see price as a direct, unmediated expression of value. In other words, they are often treated as essentially the same thing, with all prices being equated to values. When a capitalist is considering whether or not to employ new machinery at the point of production, they typically perform a simple utilitarian cost-benefit calculation. A capitalist will quietly seek to purchase a machine for a lower price than what it is projected to produce for him, in terms of extra profit, in additional surplus value. For example, if a worker, without the aid of advanced machinery, produces $100,000 worth of value in a year, but can produce $200,000 worth of value in a year with the aid of a $300,000 machine that has an estimated lifespan of 5 years, then this calculation suggests that the machine is adding $100,000 to the production process every year. Over its 5-year lifespan, it will therefore add $500,000 in total, since the machine itself only costs $300,000 but, from this perspective, transfers $500,000 in additional value to the production process. The capitalist calculates that the total value of the goods being produced by the machine is significantly greater than the cost of the machine itself. For the capitalist, this is a crucial calculation, often referred to as the amortization period, or the depreciation of the price of the machine over time. From the capitalist's point of view, he spends $200,000 after accounting for the initial purchase price against the expected value it brings, and through the machine, realizes $500,000. It truly appears, from this perspective, as if the machine itself is actively producing value, as if it is in fact the direct origin of value creation. But Marx, in his deeper analysis, gently demonstrates that it only appears that the machine is producing value because the bourgeois perspective, the capitalist's viewpoint, quietly fails to distinguish between the superficial price of the machine and its profound underlying value. If we carefully take this crucial distinction into consideration when we look at the production of machines themselves, like the production of any other commodity under the capitalist mode of production, we can see that the price at which the machine is sold is in fact less than its actual value. In other words, the machine, just like a loaf of bread, is itself made through a complex production process. Embodied labor, like the metal, the screwdrivers, the drills, the nuts and bolts, were mixed together with living labor, the human effort of workers, to produce a final product in the form of a machine. The capitalist who oversees the production of these machines is in turn in the business of producing machines specifically to realize surplus value. Therefore he exploits his own workers, in the sense that he doesn't pay them a wage that fully reflects the total value of the machine they create. Instead, he only pays them a portion of that value. It is only by paying labor a portion of the value it produces that a machine can contain more value than what it is sold for. And thus the capitalist who sells it can still realize a profit or surplus value. For instance, if laborers produce a machine that embodies $1 million of value through their collective effort, but are exploited, and therefore only paid, say, $100,000 in wages, the capitalist can then sell the machine for $400,000 and still generate a substantial profit or surplus value. This profit is realized even though the price of the commodity being sold, the machine itself, is far lower than the actual total value contained within it. Now let's imagine another capitalist who purchases this machine for $400,000 with the quiet intention of employing it in his own production process. Throughout the machine's operational lifetime, it will gently transfer its full $1 million of total value, which was originally imbued by human labor, into the production process of the goods it helps create. If the machine cost $400,000 to purchase, but it ultimately transfers $1 million in total value to the production process, this means that the capitalist who employs the machine will in essence quietly reap the remaining $600,000 in value beyond its initial cost. This precise point is absolutely key to understanding the true role of machines in production, and it is also key to understanding why labor power, living human effort, will always remain necessary to the process of value creation, even in the age of advanced machinery. Machines in themselves do not create, produce, or necessarily add new value to the production process. They only appear to do so when we harbor a misconception, a quiet illusion, that value and prices are one and the same thing. They are instead silent conduits, transferring the value that human labor initially imbued in them. Let us keep this profound fact gently in mind as we carry on to a discussion of what the broader implications are, at the structural and systemic level, of the increasing use of machines and technologies at the point of production. Throughout the long, quiet tapestry of human history, people have consistently utilized different types of tools to aid them in the production of goods. The fundamental purpose of any tool, from the simplest hand axe to the most intricate machine, is always to allow labor to be performed with less effort, or, conversely, in less time. There would be, quite simply, no logical point in using a tool if it had the opposite, counterproductive effect of making the same task more difficult and lengthier to accomplish. Therefore, tools are, in their very essence, fundamentally introduced to alleviate the amount of socially necessary labor time required in the production process, that is, the average time and effort required to produce a good under normal conditions. Throughout the history of capitalist society, Marx keenly observed, machinery has never, in its widespread application, actually had the outcome of genuinely reducing labor time, or the overall burden of work on anyone other than those unfortunate individuals who are entirely replaced by the machines themselves. Everyone else, the vast majority of workers, simply adapts, often under quiet pressure, to the integration of new technology, and carries on with the same, or even increased, degree of effort, and the same relative amount of labor time. It is a subtle shift, where efficiency gains do not translate into universal relief. Prior to the sweeping changes of the Industrial Revolution, it was, in historical terms, virtually unheard of for workers to rebel, to stand in opposition against the very implements, the tools and devices used in the production of material life. These tools were often seen as extensions of human capacity, aids to labor, but under capitalism, Marx points out, this is precisely what begins to happen. A truly remarkable shift. The working class, the laborers, slowly but surely begin to perceive machines not as allies, but as a direct threat to their very livelihood. This perception arises because machines not only completely replace many laborers at the point of production, cutting them off from earning a much-needed wage, but they also, for those who remain employed, subtly reduce workers into mechanical implements themselves. Workers become cogs in a larger machine, performing repetitive, monotonous motions day after day, for hours on end, often losing the creative joy in their work. Marx, however, with his characteristic insight, gently points out that it is not the machines in themselves that are the inherent threat to the workers. The machines themselves are neutral, tools waiting to be used. Rather, the true threat lies in the specific productive relations under which they are employed, the capitalist relations of production. Historically, tools have often served to liberate the worker from the burden of excessive toil, easing their physical load. And machines in their inherent design truly hold tremendous potential, a quiet promise, in liberating the working class from a life defined by drudgery and exploitation. This is why in Marx's framework, it is ultimately up to the workers themselves to decide when the contradictions within this system become unbearable, when to gently overthrow this system and take hold of the means of production, to harness technology for their collective benefit. They are the ones who will feel the squeeze, the pressure, and whose actions will eventually force the system to change. More on this later, but for now let us take a closer, more contemplative look at the gradual process that quietly leads up to this pivotal point, a journey through the mechanics of capital accumulation. In the intricate process of capital accumulation, as we gently observe its unfolding, machines slowly yet inexorably come to replace human laborers at the point of production. Marx eloquently expressed this phenomenon in a formula, a quiet mathematical representation of societal dynamics: constant capital C plus variable capital V plus surplus value S equals total value output W. Here, constant capital refers to the raw materials, the various tools, and the machines, all those elements of production that do not generate new value, but merely transfer their own value into the product. Variable capital represents the cost of labor power, the wages paid to workers, and it is from this living labor that new value, and thus surplus value, is generated. Surplus value, as we have explored, is the value produced by labor beyond the cost of constant and variable capital, appropriated by the capitalist. When machines are introduced more extensively into the production process, it inevitably adds to the amount of constant capital required, not only in terms of the initial cost of the machine itself, but also in terms of increased costs for larger quantities of raw materials. This is because machines, by their very design, produce more goods, which in turn necessitates the use of more raw materials. With the widespread introduction of machinery, a larger and larger portion of the generated surplus value is continuously reinvested back into the production process in the form of constant capital, more machines, more raw materials, while a proportionally smaller amount of variable capital, the cost of labor power, is required relative to the overall investment. Therefore, constant capital slowly, quietly takes over, or chews up, an ever-increasing proportion of variable capital and surplus value in relation to the total capital invested. This profound process, this shift in the composition of capital, is what Marx referred to as the organic composition of capital. The underlying contradiction here is subtle yet powerful. While capital fundamentally draws its surplus value, its very lifeblood, from living labor, variable capital, it simultaneously, and almost unintentionally, diminishes the relative proportion of variable capital required in the production process. In other words, in its relentless pursuit of more surplus value, capital eventually, and quite ironically, squeezes out the very source of that surplus value. This is what Marx referred to, with a sense of inevitability, as the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Let's revisit our formula. Constant capital C plus variable capital V plus surplus value equals sign total value output W. To understand this concept more clearly, we need to gently realize that surplus value, the The profit ultimately derives its essence from living labor, which is represented by the cost of variable capital. However, the increasing investment in constant capital, machines, raw materials, also diminishes variable capital and surplus value relative to the overall constant capital. Imagine a pie. As the entire pie total value output gets bigger due to increased productivity from machines, everyone's slice might appear larger in absolute terms. However, the proportion of the pie going to constant capital is always increasing in relation to the proportions going to variable capital and surplus value. The rate of profit, calculated as surplus value constant capital plus variable capital, tends to fall over time as constant capital grows disproportionately large compared to variable capital. This is because machines only transfer their value, they don't create new value, only living labor creates new value. So as the proportion of value-creating labor shrinks relative to the total capital invested, the rate of profit on that total invested capital also tends to quietly diminish. Capital, by its very nature, always seeks to expand the production process, to grow larger and larger. Therefore, it possesses a general inherent tendency towards overproduction, producing more goods than society can effectively consume, and the relentless tendency to maximize relative surplus value through the ever-increasing use of machines only accelerates this process of overproduction. As this intricate process continues to unfold, machines and technology at the point of production continually, almost systematically, replace living labor, producing ever-increasing amounts of commodities with fewer human hands. Eventually, this leads to what Marx called capitalist crises of overproduction, which are periods when capital has produced too many commodities in relation to the actual needs, and crucially, the effective purchasing power of society. The system therefore requires the outward expansion of capital into foreign trade, seeking new markets where greater quantities of these surplus products can be sold, often at lower prices, to maintain the cycle of expanded reproduction. In this relentless pursuit of expanded reproduction, and through the forceful, often violent, creation of a world market, capitalist social relations have become generalized at a global level, creating a world, in Marx's poignant phrase, after its own image. It is a quiet, continuous spread across the globe. As constant capital continues its quiet subsumption of variable capital and surplus value, meaning that the proportion of investment in machines and raw materials steadily increases, while the proportion of investment in human labor, and thus the source of new value, relatively diminishes, eventually, Marx argued, irreconcilable contradictions will be reached. At this point, the capitalist relations of production will no longer be able to sustain themselves. Generating surplus value will become increasingly difficult, almost impossible, due to the shrinking base of living labor from which it is extracted. If this process is allowed to unfold to its ultimate conclusion, it will eventually reach a point where machines almost entirely replace the need for living labor at the point of production. Variable capital will become so marginal, so insignificant in proportion, that the existing relations of production will no longer be able to adequately meet social needs. Furthermore, they will no longer be able to distribute the wages necessary for the working class to consume its means of subsistence. As variable capital diminishes, so too does the amount of relative surplus value, the very lifeblood of profit. Eventually, production will no longer require such large magnitudes of socially necessary labor time. The inherent efficiency of automated production will render the old relations obsolete, and the relations of production will of necessity need to go through a profound process of transformation, a revolution. Even if a future socialist society is not fully automated, it will nonetheless require such a minimal amount of socially necessary labor time that the capitalist productive relations based on exploitation and surplus value would nonetheless become entirely obsolete. The system in its quiet unfolding creates the conditions for its own transcendence. There are, of course, certain steps that capital, as a system, can take in order to ensure that this ultimate point of collapse, this fundamental contradiction, does not arrive any sooner than necessary. The most significant of these steps is often referred to, with a peculiar historical framing, as primitive accumulation. This concept was initially introduced by classical political economy to denote a supposed historic period, a pristine beginning, where the process of capital accumulation first innocently began, implying a peaceful, natural origin. However, Marx, in his incisive critique, profoundly rejects this simplistic concept of primitive accumulation as neither a truly historic one-time category nor a peaceful, innocent process of capital accumulation. He argues, instead, that this idea of so-called primitive accumulation is in reality an ongoing, forceful, and often violent process. It is a continuous act of capital, uprooting people from their traditional lands and social relations, and forcibly proletarianizing them, turning them into propertyless wage laborers, stripped of their means of self-sufficiency. This pervasive process of what Marx more properly called colonialism occurred most overtly at the very origins of capitalism, shaping the global landscape. But crucially, it also continues to this very day, albeit in different, more subtle forms, often referred to as neo-colonialism and imperialism, which still exert their influence across the globalized world. Within the vast, quiet image of colonialism and its continued manifestations, we can perceive the forging of distinct class relations, not just within nations, but at the sweeping level of geography itself. Some nations, often those of Europe and their settler colonies, quietly assume the characteristics of the bourgeoisie, acting as centers of capital accumulation and power. Others, primarily in the global south, become in essence the global proletariat, supplying raw materials and cheap labor, experiencing intensified exploitation. Contemporary Marxism often refers to this profound global division as the North-South divide, or the core-periphery divide, while others define it in terms of First World and Third World struggles. What all these perspectives quietly capture, however, is the fundamental class dimension of the world system, namely, that the nations of Europe and their settler colonies systematically extract wealth from the globally exploited regions, pouring this accumulated wealth into their own economies, perpetuating a cycle of uneven development. As the process of expanded reproduction, the relentless drive for capital accumulation, becomes global in its scope, capitalist crises also, inevitably, become global. The persistent drumbeat of imperialist wars, the intensification of global class inequality, and the devastating, undeniable impact caused by ongoing ecological destruction, all give continued, stark expression to the inherent contradictions of this global class relation. It is a quiet, yet deeply unsettling, truth of our interconnected world. Marx understood, with remarkable foresight, that the capitalist mode of production, in its inherent drive, rapidly generates powerful forces of production, ever-advancing technologies, and productive capacities. These forces, however, ultimately come into increasing conflict with the rigid, often limiting, capitalist relations of production, the existing ownership structures, and social organization of labor. As constant capital continued its relentless subsumption of variable capital and surplus value, as machines increasingly replaced human labor, and the source of new value dwindled relative to total investment. Eventually, Marx believed, irreconcilable contradictions would be reached. These contradictions would grow so profound that they would no longer be possible to maintain or contain within the existing capitalist relations of production. In order to facilitate the birth of a new world, a new social order, Marx therefore saw it as necessary, as a logical historical imperative, to move beyond the narrow confines of bourgeois politics. These politics, he argued, were designed to shape and reinforce the very processes of global capital accumulation, serving the interests of the dominant class. This global dictatorship of capital, this pervasive control realized in the modern state apparatus, a state often filled with representatives primarily drawn from the bourgeois class, is what Marx famously called a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. The state in this view is inherently a classed state, meaning it is fundamentally structured to serve the interests of the dominant economic class. This is precisely why, in Marx's analysis, genuine working-class state power has never been fully achieved and durably maintained within the traditional parameters of bourgeois parliamentarianism, with its established political parties and electoral systems. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, Marx contended, never has, and probably never will, voluntarily grant workers sufficient political power to peacefully dismantle the bourgeois state and establish a truly worker-centric state, what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat class. Such a profound shift, he believed, would require a more fundamental transformation. Marx argued with a quiet conviction that communism is the only political movement that is fundamentally distinct from all other forms of bourgeois politics. Communism, in his vision, is not a reformist movement, content with incremental changes within the existing system, nor is it merely a parliamentary movement, seeking power through conventional elections. Instead, it is, at its core, a truly revolutionary movement. It is a movement that seeks to reconstruct the entire apparatus of the state and society, from the ground up, reimagining its very foundations. It is presented as the only political party or movement that steadfastly maintains an internationalist perspective, one that actively seeks to build working-class solidarity and unity between all nations and all exploited peoples of the world. Communism, like all aspects of Marx's profound theory, needs to be understood as a dynamic, unfolding process, a journey that develops, changes, confronts, struggles, experiences achievements, as well as inevitable setbacks, much like any grand historical endeavor. Marx gently describes the lower phase of communism as a transitional condition, a period where workers have, after a long struggle, achieved effective control over the state apparatus. However, in this initial stage, they must still diligently work to build the new world, to construct a new society, all while operating within the broader confines, or what he metaphorically called the shell, of the old capitalist world. This lower stage of communism, he mused, might endure for a considerable duration, perhaps even for centuries. After all, it took many centuries for feudalism to completely replace slavery, and similarly, for capitalism to fully replace feudalism. Therefore, within this shell, and amidst the lingering contradictions of the old capitalist world, the Communist Party, or the organized working class, must maintain a revolutionary program. This program must not only be robust enough to sustain itself, but also to grow strong enough to defend the gains of the revolution and to actively aid in the ongoing revolutionary transformation of society. The general principle guiding this lower stage of communism is a gentle yet powerful maxim, from each according to their ability, to each according to their contribution. This recognizes differing capacities and efforts while building a more equitable system. The higher stage of communism, Marx envisioned, will only truly be achieved when socialism has become generalized on a worldwide scale, transforming societies across the globe. It is a distant, peaceful stage where commodities are no longer produced primarily for their exchange value, for profit in a market, but rather for their inherent usefulness, for their capacity to satisfy genuine human and social needs. In this advanced stage, labor itself is no longer alienated and exploited, no longer a source of separation and drudgery, but becomes a conscious, intentional, and collectively determined activity, a joyful expression of human creativity. Machines in this ideal future truly fulfill their potential, liberating workers from mundane drudgery, rather than enslaving them to repetitive tasks. And crucially, the immense wealth of society, the collective product of human effort and natural resources, is enjoyed by all, distributed democratically, cooperatively, and peacefully. The general principle that guides this higher stage of communism, a truly aspirational vision, is profoundly simple: from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It is a quiet promise of abundance and true human flourishing. In the Communist Manifesto, that powerful document penned by Marx and Engels, they gently lay out a general outline, a series of proposals for how a socialist state might transition from the lower to the higher stage of communism. These proposals, presented not as rigid laws, but as guiding principles, include the abolition of property in land, meaning land would be held in common, a progressive or graduated income tax, where higher earners contribute more, the abolition of all rights of inheritance, ensuring wealth isn't simply passed down through generations, the confiscation of the property of all rebels, those who oppose the new order, state monopolization of credit by means of a central bank, controlling the flow of finance, state centralization of communication and transport, ensuring public control over vital infrastructure, equal liability of all to work, with everyone contributing to society, the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, integrating urban and rural life, free education for all children in public schools, and the abolition of child labor in factories, protecting the innocence of youth. In the highest stage of communism, Marx envisioned a world where the means of production are truly held in common, collectively owned by all. The social product, the sum of all goods and services, is democratically produced and distributed without the need for exchange relations, without buying and selling in a market, by virtue of dissolving the value form of the commodity, where goods are seen primarily for their exchange value rather than their use value, and by eliminating class distinctions, the state itself, as a repressive instrument of class warfare, eventually becomes obsolete. It slowly withers away, no longer needed to mediate class conflicts. Thus, this ushers in the highest stage of communism, a classless, stateless, moneyless society. Under such profound conditions, human potential, previously constrained, will be unleashed in its entirety, and creativity may flourish in ways we can only begin to imagine. It is a vision where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a true collective liberation. On a more abstract, generalized level, communism, in Marx's deepest philosophical contemplation, represents humanity's ultimate reunification with its species being, a return to our innate creative, social, and productive essence. It signifies the complete elimination of alienated and exploited labor, finally freeing human activity from its chains. It is the abolition of the value form, transcending the logic of commodities and profit. It is the overcoming and transcending of the entire dialectic of world history, reaching a point of historical resolution. It marks the collapse of the subject-object distinction, leading to a profound sense of